So first we get you all sleepy because we've had you eat something. Then we send you all out into the hall, and then we tell you that we're going to rush through everything else. So I've got a really tough job trying to keep you awake while this is going. Now, let me give you a little bit of an introduction. Before we started with lunch, you had this brief piece of history, and that sort of inspired me to give you just a tiny touch of history for, why I'm standing here. First of all, my background in what I've done to earn a living has absolutely nothing to do with what I'm doing while I'm standing here. I've never been able to figure out how to make a living at it. So this is avocation. These are things that I find fascinating and do in my spare time. And as a few people know, most of the time that I work on this is between 5 a.m. and 7 a.m. in the morning. Those are my times. So you're getting the results of some early morning times here. You've heard about some people who are archaeologists. I'm not an archaeologist. My training and my interests have always been in ethnohistory. The difference between the two, an archaeologist is the guy who's going to go out and dig something up, brush the dirt off of an artifact, and then start working with the artifacts. The closest I get to that is I go to a library and blow the dust off of books. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. In ethnohistory, it's the historical information that we're trying to reconstruct on people that frequently don't have much of a textual history. So we don't have the luxury that you have in the old world of having a long tradition of texts. We have to milk any text that we find for as much information as we can. My interest began in central Mexico because that's where we had texts. And so I spent a lot of time working on pre-Mesoamerican or Mesoamerican pre-contact religion. And obviously that combines a little bit with my interests in the Book of Mormon. So I kind of kept up interest in that over a number of years, and to the best of the collective reconstruction memory that we have, somewhere around 1995, this one man on the internet was trying to put this list together, and he said, "Why don't you do a weekly article for us?" And I said, "Well, okay, here's the problem with weekly articles. If you do a weekly article, you have to come up with something to say every week, and I'm not sure I know how to do that." So I said, here's what we'll do. We'll just go very slowly through the Book of Mormon, and we'll kind of do a commentary on the Book of Mormon online. And what I'll try to contribute to that process is take the Book of Mormon, assuming that it is a real history of a real people that occurred in a real place, and assuming that the best information that we currently have is going to place that in Mesoamerica. Let's take that background, place the Book of Mormon in that background, and see what happens. That process took a long time. How many of you seen The Princess Bride? I would be shocked if anybody has not. How many actually read the book? Read the book. It's actually extremely good, and up until a certain point in the movie, the book is better, and then the movie's better after that. But anyway, if you remember from the book, the man who is reading to his grandson is reading from a particular book that was apparently much longer than what he was reading, but he was reading the good parts version. What I'm going to hope to do today is give you a little bit of the good parts version of things that I'm interested in. So let's start with this problem of the Book of Mormon in and as history. And what I'm going to be looking at is what we can do with the Book of Mormon that might be able to answer the question, can we demonstrate that the Book of Mormon really happened to real people? Is it an authentic record of an ancient people? So that's kind of the direction we're heading in. Okay, first of all, anybody who has not seen this picture before, raise your hand if you have not seen it. Okay, good. If you have not seen it, see, for the people who've seen it, you might know what I'm going to do with it, and we don't want to give hints to anybody. So only for those people who have not seen it before, do you see an animal in that picture? Yes, what do you see? You see a dog, okay. And don't be embarrassed if you don't see a dog, but and just because I'd like to know, is there anybody who has not seen the dog? Okay, good. That's important. Everybody raise your hand if you haven't seen the dog again. If you haven't seen it, leave your hand up, okay? Look around you and see how many people haven't seen the dog yet. Okay? That's important because that's going to tell us something really important about the kind of evidence that we have when we look at the Book of Mormon. It took me a while to find the dog the first time I looked at it too. Here's what's interesting about that. How many of you have ever looked at clouds? I've done it in the towel hanging in the bathroom. Sometimes it'll do it just in a rock somewhere. We've seen it on pieces of toast. You see pictures and you'll see a face, right? What happens is the brain creates patterns, and one of the patterns that we create more frequently than anything else are faces. We are wired to see and understand faces, and so we'll see faces where they don't exist. And one of the things that you'll notice, in those cases where it isn't really there, if you look away and look back, you'll lose it, because it isn't really there. So you see it, your brain constructs it, and you look and go, man, that's a face. And then you look away and you go back and go, dang, can't find the darn thing. In this one, once you've seen the dog, you will never be able to see that picture without seeing the dog, because it's really there. Now, next question. For those who have not seen the dog, why haven't you seen the dog? Okay? The answer is, and it's important, the answer is you're not making the connections between dots when those connections are not there. Some of us are drawing lines to outline the dog by taking the spots of a Dalmatian in this picture and being able to draw where they are not there at the moment. That is a perfect analogy of where we are right now in the Book of Mormon. In the Book of Mormon, we have some of those spots that are defining places in the Book of Mormon where we can say, this is how it fits with history. We're missing some of the lines that connect all of those dots. That does not mean that we don't have evidence. It means that we still have things to do. But for those of us who have seen the dog of the Book of Mormon, who've been able to look at the evidence that's available, it becomes impossible not to see the dog. I cannot read the Book of Mormon without now reading it into and against a Mesoamerican culture. It makes more sense to me in that context, in the background and the history of that part of the world, than it ever did when I had to read it without a historical background behind it. Now, when we get that kind of information, then we can learn things about it. And what should happen if we have the correct location for the Book of Mormon is that location should begin to teach us things about the Book of Mormon that otherwise we might not have known because we would be missing that cultural background. So, part of the good parts here is what are we going to do to try and create something where at least I can show you where the spots are so that we can begin to make the links and know what this dog looks like in the Book of Mormon. What happens in the Book of Mormon is that it is never intended, when Mormon writes this thing, it's never intended to be history. If you remember, Mormon says he's taking everything from the large plates of Nephi, and the large plates of Nephi are intended to be history. And he's doing something with them. What he tells us that he's doing with them is taking that history and saying, through this history, we will now demonstrate that Jesus is the Christ, the eternal God. That's the message. That's what he's doing. And that isn't history. That's taking lessons from history and saying, from history, let's now learn something very, very important. Now, we've got this time and place. Interestingly enough, this is a time and place that is somewhat confusing because it takes place at a particular time. And this particular time is after the conquest by the Babylonians, but before the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. So it's a really interesting time period. If you think that, we're going to talk about Lehi saying that the Babylonians are coming, he isn't saying that. They're already there. There's a whole bunch of people that are going, what do you mean the Babylonians are coming? They're sitting right next door. They came a year or so ago, whatever they came, and yeah, it was really bad, but Jerusalem's still here. What are you talking about? Okay? So one of the reasons that they didn't believe him is because they're saying it has already happened and nothing's wrong. Okay? And then, of course, it does get destroyed, which is part of the interesting timing of where the Book of Mormon comes from. Now, more importantly than that, however, we can get my slide to move again. Slide move. There we go. More importantly than that, though, the Book of Mormon reflects history. So, if you write a letter, you will be writing a letter at a certain point in time and in a certain place. And depending on what events you're describing, they may reflect history greater than what you're doing in the letter. For example, if you were to write something now and start talking about the great jokes that we heard from a president and a presidential candidate a couple of days ago, you're reflecting history. Okay? Your purpose is not to do that. You may simply be repeating some of the jokes, but the reason that you wrote them and the reason that they're there has a history that has occurred outside of what you're doing and what you're doing in the letter. And what happens in the Book of Mormon is it will reflect history much more than it's going to record a history that we know something about. So the real trick in what we're finding in the Book of Mormon is to be able to say, here is the text. Based on what we see in the text, does it give us any hints as to what was happening in the broader world around that time and in that place, so that we can have an idea of what it is that the history is all about? So we won't necessarily find it in the Book of Mormon. We'll find Nephite history in the Book of Mormon. But I'm not sure I'm going to find Maya history directly in the Book of Mormon. What I'm hoping to find is it indirectly, as it is reflected in the Book of Mormon, because it is a text that is being written in a time and a place where they're going to make references to material rather than simply say, this is what happened and this is where we are. Okay. Book of Mormon as a reflection of pre-exilic Israel. Very important that we make a distinction in where the Book of Mormon takes place. And then it goes back to that point where it's in that crucial time period of the Babylonian conquest of Israel. And the reason is that much of what we understand about the Old Testament and much of what we understand about Israelite history has been conditioned by everything that occurred after the conquest. And it's only been within, let's give it the last 15 to 20 years, when we've been getting better information about what that world was like and what the differences were prior to that time. And so when we move back and we say, let's not place the Book of Mormon against everything we've ever heard about Israel, but look at a particular time period, let's see if it will reflect that time period. So, number one, things on the left are going to be things, and this will happen throughout the PowerPoint here. Things on the left are going to come from the Book of Mormon. Things on the right are going to be coming from the cultural information of the time period. So on the left, we have the brass plates coming through the lineage of Joseph. How does that fit with anything we have in the Book of Mormon? Well, first of all, or not so much the Book of Mormon, we know where that fits. It's history of Israel. Joseph is one of the lost 10 tribes. Okay? How are we getting brass plates and people who are remnants of the lost 10 tribes in Jerusalem at the time of the Babylonian conquest? And the answer is, they were there. We know that. We even know which part of Jerusalem they lived in. We know that they moved down. Not everybody was lost. There was a significant number of people who fled from the Assyrian invasion 100 years earlier and moved down into Jerusalem. And so it's entirely probable that there are not only people from the tribe of Joseph there, but that they would have a record. And then the next thing is that record that they have ought to reflect information coming from the northern kingdom rather than the southern kingdom. And there's been several people that have gone through and looked at the facets that of the text we have for the brass plates and said, you know, the information we have there really does look like it's coming from a different source than where we're getting most of our things from the Bible, which is a Judite record. So we're getting that from the southern kingdom, other kinds of things coming from the north. So that fits with the historical information. Of course, when Lehi is predicting the destruction of Jerusalem, he isn't predicting that the Babylonians will come. They've been here. The destruction occurs later after his people have left. And then some of the things that are really fascinating is the nature of religion. This is a time period, probably going back at least 100 years, where there's been some changes happening, and there's been an attempt to solidify Israelite religion in Jerusalem around the king. And it happened earlier, and then they kind of fell back and did what they were doing again, and then Josiah comes along and he reforms things, and interestingly enough, it's his reforms that end up working. One of the reasons because the people that wanted to reform it were the ones that went to Babylon, and when they came back, they had Cyrus saying, I'm blessing these guys, and therefore it's their religion that became dominant. But other than that, there are some interesting differences when you look at what was happening prior. And one of the more interesting ones, it really appears to me that one of the things that Lehi was protesting as being lost from the religion in the process of codifying everything into the person of the king is that they were losing the concept of the atoning Messiah and looking only at the triumphant Messiah. So they're looking for a Messiah who was now a ruler like the king who would be coming back, and they were losing this concept of the Messiah who would be providing atonement. In that context, there's two really important things that I think are reflected in the Book of Mormon. Number one, when Nephi starts talking about what's really important, and he says, we've lost things out of the Bible, what's the thing that he spends all of his time talking about? Christ as the atoner. It isn't Christ as the Messiah. It's Christ as the one who provides the atonement. And that's what he spends his time on because he thinks it's being lost. Okay? Now, next really fascinating thing. We really vilify Laman and Lemuel. They get to be our bad guys, and we never say anything good about Laman and Lemuel, which is probably too bad and probably inaccurate. It's entirely likely that inside the family, there were actually Republicans and Democrats together in the same family. And they disagreed. Now, I know you have a hard time believing that somebody might disagree with a Democrat or a Republican. I understand that. But it's quite likely that what was happening in that family is you have two brothers who were the ones who were going to inherit all of the wealth and the position anyway, who were a little bit unhappy that they weren't going to be there in this new regime and this new way that was solidifying everything in Jerusalem. It really looks like Laman and Lemuel really like what was happening, and it's Nephi and Lehi who are saying, no, there's some things that really ought to be reformed. And I think you will see inside that one family a microcosm of the larger divisions in society that happened at that point in time and were not relevant after, and were rarely relevant, let's see, even 100 years earlier than that. We've got a narrow time frame where the history that is reflected in the Book of Mormon could possibly have taken place. All right, I'm not going to read this one to you. Read while I'm talking. Next thing that happens is another reflection of what's going on in this time period. This is a time period where there's all kinds of conflict happening, and so you will have fleeing prophets. And most of the time, people who flee Israel are heading towards Egypt, and in this particular case, Urijah is fleeing towards Egypt and gets caught. There's two things that are really interesting and important about that one. Number one, we now have some corroboration that there were prophets who were fleeing Israel at about this time period, so this is an accurate reflection. When Lehi leaves, he wasn't the only one. The next is we have a possible explanation for why he didn't go to Egypt. If he knew that people were getting caught when they went that way, he and the Lord would have said, let's go some other way. Let's try someplace where they're not looking for us. Next piece of information. This one's really fascinating, not so much because it's the tree of life, but because of the explanations around it. And because we're running out of time here, I'm not going to take too much more time on this one, but there's a lot of information about how this particular vision of the tree of life fits into that particular area. And I think what you ought to notice just at the end, and this is non-Mormon scholar Margaret Barker who's saying this, read this very last sentence. This revelation to Joseph Smith was the exact ancient wisdom symbolism intact and almost certainly as it was known in 600 BCE. Okay? And it's not just the tree of life. That had been around for a long time. It's the particular nature and context in which we're seeing the tree of life that is unique to that point in time. So as we look at the old world, there is definite information of where we're getting places that these two things are reflecting each other. We can see the history, and we can see how history is reflected in the Book of Mormon. Now, the tough part for people like me that love Mesoamerica is that we have so much better information for the old world. The tough part for scholars of this area in the Book of Mormon is that Nibley was so influential in what he was doing, and you heard a little bit about him before lunch, but he was so influential in his approach to things that the vast majority of LDS scholars who are studying the Book of Mormon are following Nibley into the old area where they've got texts to read and things to do. And they're coming up with wonderful stuff. The vast majority of everything that you're going to see coming in the Book of Mormon is likely to come out of 1st Nephi. And after that, the precious few people that are doing the work, and please, if you have any ideas of doing this, start. There's 2 or 3 of us around that would be more than happy to encourage you. We need help. We need as many people as we can get working on this. Okay, let's start heading towards the New World. And I'm trying to watch time here. Okay. Really important to remember that when the Nephites arrive in the New World, they do not arrive in a world that is empty. We have believed that in the past because at one point in time we probably thought the Book of Mormon is going to explain everybody's everything. And anybody who came here was related to the Book of Mormon. We know that's not correct because we know enough about history to know that pretty much wherever the Book of Mormon took place, any of the geographies that you have ever heard about, I don't care where they are, there was somebody there. This wasn't an empty continent. Now, in the Mesoamerican area, there were not only people there, but there were people who had been there for quite a while and who were in the process of developing very important cultural information. Well, one of the things that I think we have made a mistake about in the past is we have perhaps overzealously assumed that the Nephites were the cause of Mesoamerican civilization. That is not correct. They participated in Mesoamerican civilization, and I think we will see that reflected in the Book of Mormon. But the idea that they created it is known to be incorrect because we can trace the history of some of those cultural pieces of information to time periods before when the Nephites showed up. So what do we see reflected? Well, interestingly enough, we have Nephi's people, this brand new group of people, whoever they are and however many of them there are, and we don't know. In 2nd Nephi it tells us that he left with, and he names about 5 or 6 people, and then he says, and all the others who would go. And we don't know who those are because there's very few unnamed people left. Laman and Lemuel being 2 of them are really certain they didn't go with him. So people went with him, but it's a smaller group, maybe a village worth of people, not terribly large. And they get there and they said, you know what we need? We need a king. Why? Nephi didn't think they needed a king. He was ready to refuse them. But the people demanded one and they wanted one. Why? It was becoming fashion. It is at this point in time in that area of the world that there is a continuing movement of smaller egalitarian villages becoming more socially hierarchical and ending up with a king. And because they were doing that, it was encouraging all kinds of things like trade, development of all kinds of information. It was a wonderful thing. And so at this particular point in time, it makes total sense that this group of people would have said to Nephi, by the way, you know what, let's have a king. Let's have a king. Now we have a king, okay? And again, You want to read through this one? It's basically talking about the information that we were just looking at. This is the information where we're saying at this particular point in time, we're getting this type of information that's being developed. Next really fascinating thing, it comes in Jacob, because Jacob gives this great sermon. And if you think about Jacob's great sermon, his sermon makes pretty much no sense whatsoever. Okay? Think of anybody who comes and stands before you and says, look, I have two things that really, really, really bother me. I think you're wearing too much costly apparel, and I don't like you doing polygamy. Okay, I can see why those might be two things he would be unhappy about. In fact, throughout the Book of Mormon, this whole idea of costly apparel becomes a bellwether of apostasy. If you ever see costly apparel, the next thing you see is they're going to be falling away. And you kind of wonder about that. Why are the two related, and why now? Okay? Well, part of what's happening at this particular point in time, both with the Nephites and everywhere else around them, is these egalitarian villages are becoming hierarchical. What is part of the hierarchy? Part of it is the social stratification. How do you know if you are more important than someone else? One of the ways you have always known it in the history of the world is by the clothes you wear. You know, I can tell by your outfit that you are a cowboy, for those of you who are old enough to remember the song. Okay? Costly apparel becomes a way of marking who you are. It was so important in the old world that they had royal purple that only the royalty could wear. It was so important in later Aztec culture that if you were of the wrong social status and you wore, instead of the appropriate cloak down to the bottom of your rear end, instead of that you wore one down to your ankles, which was what only the royals could wear, they could kill you for it. If you wore the wrong clothing, you could die. It was that important. So what happens is we have this interesting juxtaposition. And it just so happens that two things are in the process right now. One of them is there's a continuing development of trade. Now, first of all, why trade? Think about costly apparel if there's no there's no Macy's nearby to go to, okay? If you can't go buy your clothing, how are you going to get clothing? Well, you go spin the fibers into some sort of a cloth. How are you going to get a different color? You go to some plant that's local and you make the dye and you dye the clothes. How are you going to get clothing that's different from your neighbor? It's really hard, because once you come up with something, the neighbor says, oh man, I like the cut of that cape you've got on there. I think I'll make one just like it. How do you differentiate yourself if you're all living in the same place, making your clothing out of the same materials? How do you even get costly apparel? You trade for it. You go to places that have something you don't have. And so you become hierarchical both in what you acquire and the ability to display it. Oh yeah, see, I was supposed to show you that, but you didn't want to read that much anyway. The next one. That's the one you want to take a look at. In the process of trade, they're acquiring all of these goods and they wear them to display them. So how is it that we have costly apparel? They're trading with somebody else so that they have something that somebody else doesn't have. Why is that a problem? Because they're wearing it to show that they're better than someone else. What is the problem that is always behind costly apparel in the Book of Mormon? Thinking you're better than someone else. It has nothing to do with clothing. It has to do with thinking you are better than someone else. And they're simply manifesting that by the clothing they're wearing. Now, next one. How do you get this information? This is the tie that tells us why it is that Jacob is so unhappy about costly apparel and polygamy. In looking at how these things developed, LDS archaeologist John Clark was looking at this, and he said, we have this idea. It's called an aggrandizer, someone who is trying real hard to better themselves. And if you're going to be trading, then you have to have trade goods, and the more trade goods you have, the more you can trade for, and therefore the more you can accomplish. And since there aren't any jobs to go to, and there are no firms where you can hire people, you have a family. And the bigger your family, the better your production base. And so one of the things that went along with this process was polygamy. And they said, let's get bigger families. The bigger families are going to allow us some more production base. And those two things were happening in the world that the Nephites were in at the time when Jacob is going, oh, wait a minute, this is making a mess out of us. This isn't what we want. So, does the Book of Mormon reflect history? It certainly appears to in that area, and explains why those two things simultaneously are the things that Jacob is unhappy about. There we go. Next thing, move up in history. Somewhere around 200 BC, the Nephites, I said leave, driven out is perhaps a better word. They're going from the land of Nephi, and they're going up to the land of Zarahemla, where we know, of course, they meet with the people who are the people of Zarahemla who are descended from Mulek. And then they meet with this people, and we have two pieces of information about them. They've lost their religion and lost their language. Okay? However else you want to interpret it, it means two things. They have a different religion than the Nephites, and they speak a different language than the Nephites. Okay? Now, for those of you who've done any what kind of work in historical linguistics, which I assume is all of you, right? You're all students of historical linguistics. We've got a period of 400 years. 400 years is not long enough to create mutually unintelligible languages out of a single source. You can get some dialects, but not mutually unintelligible. So if these guys are not understanding each other, something else has happened. Without really knowing too much else about it, we have Nephites coming into one area, Mulekites coming into another area, and in those two areas, they would be coming into contact with people who spoke different languages. One or both of them picked up the language of the people that they were with. It was different from the people that were with the other ones. They get together and they don't speak the same language. Somewhere in this process, not only do the people of Zarahemla, not only have they acquired a different language, but by this time they have acquired different gods and they believe something differently. They are probably quite Mesoamericanized. Sufficiently so that there is conflict in Zarahemla that is based on religion and politics. And in any part of the ancient world, anytime you hear religion, think politics. Anytime you think or hear politics, think religion. They were exactly the same thing. Who bolsters the person who gets to be the king? God, of course. And religion typically is communal, and so everybody believes the same thing. The problem is in Zarahemla that hasn't happened. You're trying to merge two different peoples together, and that creates conflict. Now, what's happening in this area in Mesoamerica? We know that there are some trade routes that would go from the putative land of Nephi up into this area where we're suspecting that the city of Zarahemla might have been. So if there's already a trade route there, now we have a decent explanation for why Mosiah went in that direction. Wouldn't be just because the Lord said so. He would have said, we already know something about these people up there, and they're at least nice enough to trade with you. Why don't you head up there? They probably won't kill you. The next thing is, we know from the history that at about somewhere around 200 BC, which is best guess ballpark for when Zarahemla is founding the city, and we can argue about when that city was founded, but since it's the city and the king Zarahemla is still there, decent chance that he's the one who founded it. About that time period, we know historically that there are Soke speakers who are moving up the river valley into that area, which would explain why somebody coming up from a more Maya-speaking area, meeting with people there, would have little differences in religion and particularly differences in language. So we've got an historical piece of information that fits in the right place in the right time, giving us an explanation for why we're getting certain historical information reflected in the Book of Mormon. That one went good. Okay, Other kinds of things that are reflected in the Book of Mormon. We have two things that happen with Mosiah and his grandson Mosiah. We have Mosiah translating Coriantumr's story from a stone. This is one of the ways that they recorded stories and history in that area. Now, they painted a lot of things, so they might have had something that was painted, but in this particular case, it specifically says that there was a stone. If Joseph, who is writing this book, this imaginative novel, is already imagined plates and is later going to talk about plates from the Jaredites, it's really unusual that he's talking about a stone, except in this context it is not. Now, we also have his grandson Mosiah interpreting writing with stones, with interpreters, which are later given to Joseph Smith and used for that same purpose. We don't have Mesoamericans who are translating documents with stones, but this is a place where they do have this sastun, which is some sort of divinatory rock where they can communicate with, understand the will of God using a stone. Now, the time period's different. And you probably don't want to read through all of that. What's really important is down at the bottom. You see that, Mark? That's you. Mark in the back there. This is information I borrowed quite liberally from him, since I didn't know it until he was telling me about it. But there's really important information that says that the concept of using a stone to receive information, and you know that Alma is going to consult God through the interpreters to find out what to do to help Captain Moroni with the armies, that is a concept that is at home. Although in this particular case, our time periods are a little bit different, there's enough information there that tells us that this is something that is a cultural facet of that area. Next thing that's really fascinating, we have Mosiah the grandson, who changes the nature of politics, which of course has to go along with religion, and he changes everything from a kingship to the rule of the judges. That sounds like a completely culture-changing kind of thing, except in Mesoamerica it would not have been. In that area of the world, there would be councils that would work with the ruler, and they were kind of just below, and in that area of the world, what appears to happen is you've got a king at the top and then this council down below, and what it really looks like in the Book of Mormon is they just took the top off and said, well, let's just move down a layer. What happens with the reign of the judges? For those of you who think that it reflects Republican concepts, it does not. The judges inherit their position. They're not always elected. There is something that's called the voice of the people, but the voice of the people was active when King Benjamin was made king. If I remember correctly, it was certainly active when Mosiah is trying to get his sons enthroned. So the voice of the people, whatever that was part and parcel of the monarchy and simply becomes something that is continued when they move that top piece off. So in the context of that area, this isn't the major change that it appears to be. And it isn't something that is saying, by the way, let's take North American United States democracy and impose it on this record. That isn't it at all. Information about when this appears to have happened later. Chichen Itza is coming much later than the Book of Mormon, but we find that there is a similar concept there where it looks like that person of the king has been removed and now we have council rule. So same area of the world, same concept, different time period, but it appears to parallel the kinds of things that are happening in the Book of Mormon. The story of the anti-Nephi Lehis is really quite strange. But this is one where if you put that story in a Mesoamerican context, there are certain parts of it that make sense that don't make sense otherwise. For example, these people claim to be murderers. All of the women claim to have been murderers. Who in the world has murdered that many people as a nation? Where is it that there is this whole group of people, imagine everybody here, saying, oh yeah, we're murderers? It doesn't happen. Okay? If you've been in the military service, you might have killed someone. No one calls that murder. Okay? You heard about that earlier. There's a difference between killing and murder. So what is it that's happening? What appears to be happening is that these are all people who have been part of a Mesoamerican cult of war where their religion was intimately involved with not only warfare, but the human sacrifice that was attendant to warfare. And if you were someone who supported a religion that condoned, accepted, and promulgated human sacrifice, you might believe when you were converted to the gospel that you had in fact unrighteously been murdering someone. Okay? Now, next piece. One of the things it talks about is that they buried their weapons. Oh, that's fine. We all know about burying the hatchet, which of course is much, much later and very different than what these guys are doing. Burying the hatchet was a symbolic burial of a single hatchet, and nobody else gave up their weapons. In this particular case, they all did. However, there is a Mesoamerican process where they call it a cache, comes at the beginning of major events, and one of the things that you will do at the beginning of a major event is to offer offerings to the god and bury them. Now, it does not say that they broke their weapons, but I kind of suspect that they did, because that was one of the things that might happen in one of these caches, that you would break it as part of the offering to the gods. You can imagine that if you had buried a few $1 million in gold bars in your backyard ground, and you'd done that as an offering to God, if things really got bad, you'd probably remember where you buried them. Okay? The fact that they buried the weapons does not mean they could not have them again, but it was a covenant, and it was a new representation of the covenant. So religiously, it makes sense in that context. Part of the really amazing story, of course, of these people is that they submitted as the Amalekites were coming in to take over. Part of the story that we forget about, but is tremendously important, is that the Amalekites were trying to replace the king. They were trying to take over the kingship in this land of, Mormon people call it land of Nephi, pretty much assured that the people of Laman did not call it land of Nephi. But they wanted to replace the king. One of the things that you had to do, based on Maya culture, if you are going to seat a king, you are going to sacrifice people who were captured in battle. That's one of the things the king needed to do. The anti-Nephi Levites weren't fighting back. They didn't count. If you're going to, the Amalekites took over the city. There was no resistance. Of course they're going to seat the new king. But now they need people who were captured as they were fighting, and there weren't any. So they do what Mesoamericans kings often did. They went off to some totally unsuspecting city, raided it, and the only time in the Book of Mormon that it ever mentions one of these wars where they do not impose tribute but they take captives is in this case. The only time we hear about it. They don't say, I think I'm going to go over there and I think we're going to loot everything there and come back rich. They don't do it. Other times they did. Other times they said, hey, by the way, we conquered you, give us stuff. This time they said, captives. And they took captives back, because that is what they needed to seat their king. All right, this next one we're going to just whip through. You heard Brother Lund talking about the volcanoes, and so this is another one where we have an area of the world where these kinds of activities replicate what happens in the Book of Mormon. What we would really love, of course, is to be able to say we know exactly which volcano exploded at that particular time point so that we could say this is the one. Two things. One, dating the eruption of the volcano is not precise. I know of one from San Salvador that they've redated multiple times, kind of fiddling back and forth with a couple of hundred years. Second, based on the information that we have in 3rd Nephi, it is at least clear to me that there was not a single volcanic eruption, but there were several that were happening in about that time period. And so we're getting reports from different places that are occurring. So this is a time of volcanic activity, probably in more than one place. And all that we can say is, first of all, this is an area that is prone to volcanic activity, and that within a, let's say, 100 to 200 year time range around the time of Christ, there were known eruptions of volcanic eruptions in that area. Exactly which one, don't know yet. Cross my fingers, we'll figure it out at some point in time. All right, you got to go to this last one. Here we go. Here's what I want to end with. On the left is a statement I see frequently in people who are looking at Mesoamerican information. They say, I have read these things about the Maya, I have read these things about anybody down in Mesoamerica, and they do not look like the Book of Mormon at all. Okay? So, optical illusion again. What are you looking at on that picture? It's a house. What else do you see? You see what? Brickwork. Yeah, you see a shadow of a tree. How many of you see a face? Haha, see? Wasn't the first thing you saw, right? If you look, how many of you have not seen the face yet? Okay, good, you're seeing the face. That's important again. Because once you have seen the face, you look at that and the first thing you see is the face staring at you. Although it is a picture of a house, it is a picture that has brick, it is a picture of the shadow of a tree, and none of those things are faces. So it is entirely possible, and indeed probable, that someone will look at that and say, yeah, I don't see a face there. I see houses, and houses don't look like faces. That does not mean that the face is not there. The fact that somebody else looks at Mesoamerica and says, I don't see the Book of Mormon, probably says more about the way they envision the Book of Mormon than it does about the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon is there. If you have learned to see the connections between the spots, once you have seen the dog in the Book of Mormon, you cannot unsee the dog. Once you have seen the face, regardless of whether or not anybody else sees it, you know that it is there because you have seen it and it's real, because you're understanding something that they're missing. The fact that they miss it does not mean that it's not there. And it is there, and more we're learning how to connect the dots so that the face becomes clear, that the outline of the dog becomes clear, so that more and more we learn that the Book of Mormon is a reflection of a real history in a real place. And that on top of all of that marvel, it does teach us that Jesus is the Christ, the eternal God. In Jesus' name, amen.